to ask, please switch off your mobile devices. We are now at the third lecture in our series, Jerusalem and the Temple, from creation to destruction and beyond. The lecture this evening will be on the topic, blind hatred and the destruction of the Second Temple. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Gafni. Gafni is a Professor Emeritus of Jewish History in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is one of the leading researchers in Israel and throughout the world in the realm of Jewish history, the Second Temple, the Mishnah, and the Talmudic periods. Professor Gafni, please.
Okay. I'm not certain that we will get to the destruction itself. I'm reminded many years ago when I would go off to give a lecture, my children were a lot younger, and I would hear them mumbling in the background, but loud enough. You don't hear me? No, somebody up there should be taking care of that. Can you hear me? Okay. There are two microphones here. Okay. Anyway, I was saying that I remember going off to give similar lectures and having one of my kids kind of whisper out loud to a sibling, Abba's off to destroy the temple again. I think, though, that today we'll be dealing primarily with the events, but more than that, the atmosphere leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple. And then in our last session, deal with the immediate afterward and the long-range aftermath of the destruction. The revolt, the war against the Romans, the Great Revolt of 66-70, in many ways was a tragedy within a tragedy. It was a dual tragedy. The ultimate tragedy, of course, was the destruction of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem. That's obvious. But within that tragedy is possibly one that we tend to note more than the tragedy itself, and that is the fact that Jews, rather than channeling all of their efforts against a common Roman enemy, were in fact involved in a growing process of internal strife, what the rabbis would call sinat chinam, right? Baseless hatred. We're going to find today that the situation was far more complex than simply baseless hatred leading to the destruction. I have to qualify that statement by saying I'm not really certain if I know what baseless hatred means. I myself have never been party to baseless hatred. The people that I've hated over the years really deserved it. And so I will have to be referring to terms that I've heard bandied by journalists, politicians, of course, rabbis, and I already expect to receive phone calls from Kol Yisrael as Tisha B'Av. This is something that happens to me every year. This is my big holiday, Tisha B'Av, right? And I will invariably get somebody interviewing me and wanting to direct the discussion to is baseless hatred today anything like it was in the Second Temple period? And I usually give that response that I just gave you, and very often that's where the dialogue ends. What I'd like to show, however, is that things, as I said, were far more complex than simply Jews fighting against Jews. Well, to be honest, all of the Second Temple period, and we've seen this already to a degree, can be categorized as one of disputes among, or dissension, if we like, among different groups of Jews. This goes way back to the return to Zion from Babylonia, where we encounter those who returned from Babylonia versus Am Haaretz, those people who remained in the land following the Babylonian conquest, and there's definite tension between the two groups. When you read the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, you sense that tension. Later on, of course, and we dealt with this last week, the tension between the traditional elements of the Jewish community in the Hellenistic period versus that growing Hellenistic party which encroached even upon the leadership of Jerusalem and the temple, the high priesthood, Menelaus, Jason, and so on. When we enter into the Hasmonean period and on into the Roman period, we, of course, encounter the phenomena of sectarianism. And clearly, this is one of the, I would almost say, one of the outstanding factors of the, at least second half of the Second Temple period, where we encounter different types of Jews embracing different philosophies, different theologies. Most of you, I'm sure, are all acquainted with the disputes between Pharisees and Sadducees. They're known to all of us, and even non-Jews are aware of that because these same Pharisees and Sadducees appear in the New Testament, not only in Josephus and not only in rabbinic sources. If it were only that type of sectarianism, Pharisees and Sadducees, I suspect the rabbis would not have formulated or articulated the issue of sinat chinam as being the basis for the destruction. If you look at the handout, what I'm going to claim, at least, is that this particular type of sectarianism could have survived without an ultimate outbreak of internal bloodshed. Josephus, in a number of places, describes these different groups, and I'm not going to go into full descriptions of who the Pharisees were, who the Sadducees were, and then, of course, later on, the Essenes, which many of us identify with the Dead Sea sect. But I wanted to bring one particular text because I find that there's really a dovetailing of Josephus and rabbinic sources. Josephus says in source number 1, they, the Pharisees, are extremely influential among the townsfolk. All prayers and sacred rites of divine worship are performed according to their exposition. In other words, he claims that the Pharisees really run the show in terms of religious behavior. The Sadducees hold, and now he goes into a brief review of their behavior and beliefs, and I'm sure many of you, I would assume most of you know, there's a dispute between Pharisees and Sadducees regarding the phenomena of oral tradition versus written tradition, on the belief in resurrection, Tchiyat HaMeitim. The Pharisees believe in Tchiyat HaMeitim, the Sadducees don't. On the issue of reward and punishment in this world or only in the next world, those are the major disputes that most of us are familiar with. But he says that the Sadducees, who hold the following beliefs, there are but few men to whom this doctrine, this Sadducean doctrine, has been made known. But these are men of the highest standing. This has often been interpreted to mean that the aristocracy tended towards Sadducees, whereas the Pharisees represented the common man. That's not always the case. First of all, because we encounter wealthy Pharisees, later on wealthy rabbis, right, and vice versa. Although we don't have too many poor Sadducees floating around, that's true. But he goes on to say something else. These men are of the highest standing. They accomplish practically nothing, however, meaning the Sadducees. For whenever they assume some office, and here he's clearly referring to the high priesthood, though they submit unwillingly, and perforce yet submit they do to the formulas of the Pharisees, since otherwise the masses would not tolerate them. And you can already conjure up the image of one of the images that appears in our sources of the adherents of the Pharisees throwing their etrogim, right, on a high priest, a Sadducean high priest, who on the Festival of Tabernacles did not believe in the custom or did not partake in the custom of nisuch hamayim, of a libation of water on the altar, poured the water on his feet, and he was immediately pelted with citrons, right? So the image you get here through Josephus is they seem to have come to some sort of a modus vivendi. Yes, the Sadducees may not have been very happy with the situation, but they submitted to Pharisaic instruction because otherwise the masses would rise up against them. And sure enough, this seems to be corroborated by at least one example in the Mishnah and in the elaboration of the Mishnah, source number 2, and the elaboration source number 3. It describes the issue of where the incense was offered up on the Day of Atonement. There was a clash between Pharisees and Sadducees. Where did the high priest offer up the ketoret? According to the Pharisees, he was to offer up this incense within the sanctuary, not in public view. Whereas the Sadducees claim he does this in the great courtyard, right? That is to say, where the masses would see this particular ceremony taking place. And of course, sociologists have immediately suggested the Sadducees wanted to enhance their status by performing as much as possible in public view, whereas the Pharisees told the high priest, go indoors where nobody would see this. The Mishnah says, however, in general, he, the high priest, on the eve of the Day of Atonement, or on the days preceding the Day of Atonement, is attended by elders of the court, of the Beit Din, who read to him from Leviticus chapter 16 concerning the ceremonial of the Day of Atonement. In other words, you have to be very sensitive here. The source seems to be kind of casting a certain aspersion on the high priest. He may not know the laws of the Day of Atonement, right? High priest though he may be, he's not all that well-versed in what the Torah demands of the high priest. We have to teach him. And so he was attended by the elders of the court, and they say to him, my lord, the high priest, say it aloud. In other words, repeat the source from Leviticus, lest you have forgotten or not studied this, which is really kind of a cut, right? In other words, you went to your Mamlachti Tzduki school, right? And they were not all that particular about maybe teaching the laws and how they should be, right, carried out on the Day of Atonement. And then it gets even more extreme. They said, my lord, the high priest, we are delegates of the Beit Din, and you are our delegate and the delegate of the Beit Din. We command that you take an oath by him who has made his abode in this house, that you shall not alter one thing about which we have spoken. He's forced to take an oath. They don't trust him, which already you get the sense of tension. And then he takes his farewell, meaning he departs and weeps, and they depart and weep. Neither side is happy with the situation, and yet they realize that this is the only way peace can be maintained at the temple on the Day of Atonement. The Tosefta, which is an elaboration here of the Mishnah, explains why both sides weep. Why did he depart weeping? Because he had to take an oath. Why did they depart weeping? Because they had to demand an oath. Again, neither side is happy. And now they tell us a story that explains this sensitivity. And why did they demand the oath? For there was a case of a Bothusi and Baitusi. Baitusi in rabbinic literature often is a synonym for Sadducee. There is a particular group referred to as Bothusians, and scholarship is replete with all sorts of suggestions as to the etymology. But here it clearly refers to a Sadducean. There was a case of a Baitusi who offered up incense while outside, meaning according to Sadducean teaching. And when he departed, he said to his father, all your days you would teach that the incense is offered up outside the sanctuary, but you would not act on this. In other words, in the end, you always adhered to Pharisaic teaching. You did it indoors until I appeared and did it. His father said, although this is what we teach, we do not act on this, but adhere to the words of the sages. By the way, this is interesting. You will find that Chazal, the rabbis, did not like the word Prushim, Pharisees, for themselves. The word Pharisee, when it appears in rabbinic literature, is more often than not in the mouths of their adversaries. The Sadducees say, Atem ha-Prushim omrim, you Pharisees say the following, Omrim lahem chachamim, the sages reply. And it could be because Pharisee may have a negative connotation those who have removed themselves, poresh min hatzibur, even though you can find a positive meaning, prushim kedoshim, but the rabbis were never happy with that phrase. And so here the high priest, or the father of the high priest, says, we adhere to the words of the sages, and you now have breached this understanding. I have doubts as to your longevity. 3 days did not pass, and they placed him, the high priest, in his grave. You can all imagine, I will not tell you what I think may have happened, right? People are innocent until proven guilty, right? But clearly, somebody was very unhappy, right, with what this high priest did. Now, this is interesting. Here the source says that they had some sort of a modus vivendi. They were able to find a way of existing with one another that, had it continued, would not have brought about this ultimate, right, clash, and I would almost say a physical clash between the two groups. And this is probably true in a lot of issues pertaining to the temple. And I'll give you just one other example. One of my colleagues, Professor Al Baumgarten, once wrote an interesting article on this, where he says, we know that the Pharisees and the Sadducees calculated the calendar differently. They had different calculations. They counted the Omer, according to the Pharisees, the day after Passover. According to the Sadducees, on a Sunday, Mimachol Rata Shabbat, you begin counting. Sadducees said it would always begin on a Sunday. Pharisees at the day after Passover. If they had different calculations, we would expect people showing up at the temple for various holidays or other observances, only to be told, sorry, you're late. We did this last week, or we did this a few days ago. You never hear that. And Baumgarten suggested there might have been something that we could refer to as a temple calendar. In other words, both sides realized, and we don't know how that calendar functioned, right? But both sides realized this is the only way you can keep the temple operating on a regular basis, by coming to some sort of a mutual understanding. So were it only debates between Pharisees and Sadducees, Second Temple history probably provided them with enough precedents to figure out how to get along. However, this was not the case regarding other sects. There were Jewish sects who considered anyone who did not behave like them or believe like them to be the enemy, to be ultimately the target of God's wrath, no less than the evil Gentiles. And I'm, of course, referring to the Dead Sea sect. The Dead Sea sect, in one of its books, The War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, describes some sort of an eschatological end-of-days battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, sons of light and the sons of darkness. And this is sort of a series of battles. 7 battles will take place, and it will be sort of a seesaw affair. We will win one, they will win, meaning the sons of darkness, we, they, until the 7th ultimate battle takes place, and that is when God appears and the ultimate redemption takes place. But what happens to the sons of darkness, and who are the sons of darkness? If you look at source number 4, the first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness. Now, who are they, the sons of darkness? The army of Belial, the troops of Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, and Philistia. In other words, all the biblical names. Now remember, these tribes no longer really exist in these names. But of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls do this all the time. They use biblical terminology to refer to the enemy. The Romans are very often not referred to in the sectarian literature as Romans, but as Kittim, right, or something like that. So here you have all of these biblical names, the sons of Ammon and Philistia, and the troops of the Kittim of Ashur. But who else is on the side of the sons of darkness? And this is the important point, right? Supporting them are those who have violated the covenant. And of course, those who have violated the covenant are those who were party to the covenant originally. Who were those party to the covenant? The Israelites. But those who were party to the covenant, the Brit, B'nai Brit, but nevertheless violated it They will be among the sons of darkness, ultimately to be annihilated. And opposing them, the sons of light, the sons of Levi, the sons of Judah, meaning us, and the sons of Benjamin. And of course, where is the sect? Those exiled to the wilderness. Remember, the sect is not in Jerusalem. The sect could not partake in the service in Jerusalem because they believed that the temple had been defiled by these priests. They're off in the wilderness, maybe Qumran, right, the desert, the Judean desert. And so we are the forces of good in the wilderness, and we oppose all those who have violated the covenant, and we shall fight against them. So not just Gentiles, but wayward Jews are now the enemy to ultimately be annihilated. And if you look at the next source, source number 5, in another sectarian text, the Damascus document, it's called the Damascus document because according to the sect's historical memory, at one time they were forced to flee the land of Israel and run off to Damascus, and then they returned. And all the adherents of the covenant, adherents I would probably have translated all of those who were originally party to the covenant, B'nai Brit, all the adherents of the covenant who have breached the limit of the law, when the glory of God appears to Israel, meaning in the ultimate end of days, they will be cut off from the midst of the camp, and along with them all the wicked of Judah. Now, here you already have words that are far more extreme than Pharisees versus Sadducees, right? Here, nothing will remain of the sons of darkness. That will be like what results in from some sort of nuclear catastrophe. They will become dust. Now, this is important. And we're going to see that this may have had an impact. Ideas like this may have had an impact in the very last days of the Second Temple, literally on the days leading up to the destruction. And I'm going to argue that it's quite possible that ideas like this ultimately wind up in certain circles of Jerusalem and explain behavior that we're going to encounter. But now we come to the first historical question. So my point should be clear. Yes, there's sectarianism, but not all sectarianism must have led to internal bloodshed. When did opposition to Rome begin? Here we have an interesting, I would almost say, contradiction within the writings of Josephus Flavius. In one of his sources, and that's source number 6 here, he will tell us that opposition to Rome began the day the first Roman soldier stepped on territory of the land of Judah, meaning in the year 63 BCE, when Pompey conquered the land of Israel, when the Roman Republic still conquered Israel. Josephus makes this point in an interesting place, not at the beginning, not during during the description of Pompey's conquest at first, but at the very end of the Second Temple period, where he places a speech in the mouth of Titus. Titus is about to destroy the temple. He is literally outside the gates, outside the wall of Jerusalem, makes one of those many speeches that Josephus probably wrote, as I said, in his study in Rome years later. But the thrust of the speech is very interesting. Titus says as follows: "Well, sirs, are you at length sated with your country's walls? You who, without bestowing a thought on our," meaning Roman, strength, "or on your weakness, have through inconsiderate fury and madness lost your people, your city, and your temple." In other words, Titus says, you brought it upon yourself. Your madness, and of course it is madness to go to war against the Roman army. We'll talk about that in a moment. But now he adds a line. You, this is Pompey addressing the Jews, you who from the first, ever since Pompey reduced you by force, never ceased from revolution, and have now ended by declaring open war upon the Romans. In other words, according to this text, in the Jewish war, Jewish opposition to Rome began on day 1 of the Roman occupation, from the days of Pompey. Now this is interesting because as we will see in a subsequent page, in page number 3, in his second book, in his second major work, The Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus will claim that the first articulate and formulation of opposition to Rome begins only after Herod's death, only in and the banishment of his son Archelaus in the year 6 of the Common Era, meaning some 60 plus years much later, and only after Herodian rule. Antiquities will say a group shows, and we'll read the source in a few minutes, the book of Antiquities will claim there appeared a group in Galilee who formulated a new theology that one must not be subservient to Rome or to any other human being, but only to God. And he's going to claim that that was a new Jewish philosophy that never existed before. He's going to call it the fourth philosophy. He said, yes, until now there were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, but following Herodian rule, a fourth philosophy appeared that considered subservience to Rome to almost be idolatry. Now this is interesting. In other words, in the book of Antiquities, he pushes off the beginning of opposition in many ways to a much later period, whereas in the Jewish War, he says it's from day one. Why this discrepancy? Here, you have to understand what Josephus was doing. He wrote 2 major works. He also wrote an autobiography and another book called Against Apion, which we quoted a few weeks ago. But his 2 major works were the Jewish War and the Antiquities. The Jewish War is what it claims to be, a description of the war the Jews fought against the Romans. It was written just a few years after the revolt itself and after the destruction. Josephus moves to Rome. His patrons are the Flavian dynasty, meaning Vespasian, who fought in Israel, and then his son Titus, who completed the work by destroying Jerusalem. Both are still alive when Josephus begins the Jewish War. And as a result, the flavor of the Jewish War in many ways is an accusation against the Jews. They brought upon themselves this tragedy. They are a rebellious people from day one, right? They are responsible. And even the title, many people have noted this, The Jewish War. Who would give a title like that? What type of an author would use the phrase the Jewish War? Now, I don't know, I know some of you in the audience, but I don't know how many of you ever studied Latin, right, in school, right? But I'm willing to bet that if you took Latin, I'm almost willing to bet I know what the first book is that you read, and if not the first, then the second, probably Julius Caesar's The Gallic War, right? That is the book that in other words, the Romans would claim, we fought many wars. We fought the Gallic War, we fought the Jewish War. Even the title of the book suggests a Roman perspective. And as a Roman perspective, and even though Josephus doesn't hide the fact that he's Jewish, nevertheless, this is really, in many ways, an accusation against the Jews for simply, as you saw here, madness, going to war against Rome. 20 years would pass. Josephus is in Rome. We get to the 90s of the first century. Titus has died, Vespasian has died, and what shall I say, the immediacy of what has just taken place has now calmed down a bit. And Josephus writes another book, The Jewish Antiquities. The word antiquity should already give away that this is a much more favorable presentation of the Jewish people. They are an ancient people. The Antiquities meaning this is a people that has a history. This is a legitimate people. And in many ways, the Jewish Antiquities is an apology, right, for the Jews. Apologia meaning, in many ways, it's not just an excuse, but it's rather a defense of Judaism. Here, he will say something very interesting. This Jewish philosophy, this fourth philosophy that you can't be subservient to Rome, this isn't part of the Torah. This is a new innovation. In other words, he's going to push off the beginning of the anti-Roman sentiment in the Antiquities because there he wants to present Jews as being a normal and even maybe a proud and dignified people. So yes, there were these brigands who invented an anti-Roman philosophy, but they don't represent true Judaism. And so you have to be very careful when you read Josephus to know what his agenda is when he writes each of the two books. If you don't know the agenda, you can't appreciate the work itself. When you read Josephus in the Jewish War, it is clear that already beginning with Pompey, there was some opposition to the Roman conquest. Interestingly enough, part of the original opposition stemmed from one branch of the Hasmonean family. Remember something. Prior to the Roman conquest, there was a Jewish state in Israel, the Hasmonean kingdom. And we sometimes forget that the fall of the Hasmonean kingdom was not a long, drawn-out affair. The Hasmonean kingdom reached its greatest, first, its physical expansion and its greatest strength under Alexander Jannaeus, who died in the year 76 BCE. Only 13 years later, there was no longer a Hasmonean state. In other words, Jannaeus Yanai dies in 76. In 63, the Romans conquer the land. However, the Hasmonean family was split among the two sons of Jannaeus and Queen Salome, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus appears to be much more pliable, much more acquiescing, willing to get along, to come to some sort of if not a rapprochement, nevertheless, to serve Roman needs in the land of Israel. He will be recognized by Pompey ultimately as high priest, not as king. The monarchy is abolished, but as leader of the people. His brother Aristobulus, we encounter as leading the opposition party. Now and here I brought a few sources just to give you a sense. Source number 7. During Pompey's long period of indecision, whether to complete the onslaught and capture of Jerusalem, he arrives at the city but has to decide, is he going to capture it? Sedition broke out within the walls. The partisans of Aristobulus insisting on a battle, while those of Hyrcanus were for opening the gates to Pompey. Interestingly, in rabbinic literature, we find a somewhat similar story. The rabbis will tell us that at the last stages of the Hasmonean monarchy, the adherents of Hyrcanus were outside of the city, which clearly suggests they were part of the siege with the Romans. The adherents of Aristobulus were within the city. And then the rabbis tell a well-known story where those within the city required animals for their sacrifices. Those outside, the Jews outside, nevertheless believe in sacrificial worship. And so they would offer up along the wall, they would offer up to their opponents, but Jewish opponents in the city, some animal for sacrifice, and they would be given funds in response by those within until, and this is the story, of course, which takes on a legendary aspect, until a Greek advised them, as long as you will allow them to keep on sacrificing, the city will never fall. And so on the morrow, they place in the basket that's going to be lifted up on the temple wall, they place a pig instead of an animal to be offered up. And as the hoofs of the pig touch the wall, all of Judea encounters some sort of an earthquake, and that led to the fall. Ultimately, that leads to the fall of Jerusalem. In other words, the rabbis describe this as an abomination. Here, the two sons of Alexander, Jannaeus and Salome, ultimately in their internal clash, assist the Romans in conquering the city. Here, it describes that within the walls itself, there was dissension between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Later on, and the source tells us that Pompey reinstated Hyrcanus as high priest in return for his enthusiastic support shown during the siege. Source number 8 tells us that Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, mustered a considerable force and caused Hyrcanus serious annoyance by his raids upon Judea. The Roman governor of Syria, Gabinius, marches against Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, bringing about his defeat. But then, we are told, They were soon, however, involved in fresh troubles through the escape of Aristobulus from Rome, and once more he succeeded in mustering a large body of Jews, some eager for revolution. And Alexander, son of Aristobulus, heading a new Jewish revolt, collected a vast army, proceeded to massacre all Romans in the country. Now, here I have to tell you a story. This is a true story because it happened to me, right? Many years ago, so everybody knows this, or anybody who's ever read Josephus knows that there was dissension among the sons of Alexander Jannaeus, and this leads to the fall of the Hasmonean monarchy. Many, many, many years ago, I participated in a program. It was a Hanukkah TV program. It's when there was one channel, right, in black and white, and these were these programs that you could either watch or go to sleep, or go to sleep while watching, right? And the theme of the program was, why did the Hasmonean state fall? Right? And that's the theme. And then, as was always done in Israeli television, they would invite two politicians, right? And ask them why the state fell, and they would invite then a historian to represent the truth. Because obviously, you're not going to get that from these guys, right? And this was what they used to call in television world talking heads, right? They sat us behind the table, and each of us was asked to express an opinion why the Hasmonean state fell. And so they put these two politicians next to me, sitting at this table, one of them to my right, and the other to my left, my far left, believe me. And they asked both of them, and you'll see how this relates to the source we just read, right? Why did the Hasmonean state fall? And they asked the person to my right. I'm not going to name names who these people were, but I thought it was very proper that they asked the person to my right first, because you know that in Jewish tradition, the first person to do something is always a Kohen, and so they asked her first. But I can't mention names. And why did the Hasmonean state fall? Well, because of internal dissension. There was no unity. The sons of Jannaeus, we just read, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus were fighting amongst themselves, and if there's no Jewish unity, the state is going to fall. Then they asked the person to my left, why do you think the Hasmonean state fell? And he knew, of course, immediately why. Because they had overextended themselves. They had conquered territories, and these territories were populated by and large by a non-Jewish population, and we all know that conquest corrupts, and so the state became a corrupt state, and then it sort of imploded because a corrupt state cannot maintain existence for long. It's going to collapse, and that's why. Now, I'm sitting between these two people, and I know why the state fell. Because Rome was going about capturing all of the Middle East at this time, right? And they had just captured Syria. Pompey came down to Judea from Syria, and they're on their way to Egypt, because ultimately that will be the ultimate conquest of the Hellenistic East, right? The Seleucid Empire in Syria and the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. Anyone who knows the map knows that if you want to go from Syria to Egypt, you're going to have to go through another little parcel of land, right? And they were eating up little territories like Judea for breakfast at the time. In other words, all of the Middle East was going to be conquered by the Roman Republic. But of course, I couldn't say that. That sounded too simplistic. And what I tried to say was, you know, both of these theories that we just heard are kind of, what shall I say, a bit silly. I mean, the first one being, yes, because there was internal dissension, the sons of Jannaeus were at odds with one another, and I always imagine, let's assume, right, that there was no internal dissension among the two sons. Let's assume that Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II were actually allies, right? Then, of course, Pompey in Syria would have clearly said, what? Aristobulus and Hyrcanus together in one army, right? against the Roman Republic, he would have been shaking, as it were, in his shoes. And of course, let's go look for some divided country, because we can't, we don't conquer unified, right, entities as they were, much too. Now, the other scenario I found no less interesting, right? The other scenario, of course, being the country had been corrupted, and once it was corrupted, it could not maintain existence. Let's assume it had not been corrupted. Let's assume, by this time, of course, the queen was Queen Salome, Shlom Tzion. Let's assume that Queen Salome was sitting in the palace all day, I don't know, reading Tzen Arena or whatever it is that pious women did at the time. The two sons of Janaeus and Salome were off in a yeshiva or kollel somewhere learning. In other words, really an upstanding Jewish state. Then, of course, Pompey would have said in Syria, we can't conquer these people. These are good people, right? These are incorruptible, as it were. Let's go looking for some corrupt state. I'm sure there must have been a lot in the area, and they would have gone elsewhere. And so I think it's quite obvious what I'm trying to say. To simply use this type of history as a prop for understanding why the Romans conquered, right? Now, this is not getting to Sinat Chinam yet. I'm going to get to that, right? But to use this dissension as the ultimate cause for the fall of the Hasmonean kingdom is facile. It's a bit too simplistic, and I would caution against it. But it does tell us that beginning with Roman conquest, there was an opposition to the Roman presence. We hear this in source number 9, again, when Hyrcanus becomes high priest, as he was, appointed by Pompey, ultimately he introduces into his court all sorts of advisors, one of them being an Idumean whose family had converted to Judaism. His name is Antipater. Antipater has a few sons. One of them is Herod, the other is Phasael, right? And Herod is appointed governor of Galilee as a young man, and he shows his true colors. You can see this in source number 9. Energetic by nature, at once found material to test his mettle. Discovering that Ezekias, and we'll encounter his son in a minute, a brigand chief at the head of a large horde, was ravaging the district on the Syrian frontier. He caught him and put him and many of his brigands to death. Brigands in Josephian language refers to various opponents to the Roman conquest. In other words, what we will later refer to as, zealots. We'll talk about the word zealots in a moment. But obviously in the book of the Jewish War, the opponents to Rome, Josephus defines them or describes them as brigands. Now, all of this tells us about the earliest anti-Roman stirrings. But when we get to section number C, page 3, we find that Josephus, in his other book, The Antiquities, claims, as I said, that a type of ideology began to emerge, and among a certain group of Jews, not all Jews, and not zealots. And here I have to make a very important distinction. We tend to use the word zealots as an overall, right, umbrella phrase for all the opponents to Rome. That's not the case according to Josephus. He will distinguish between zealots, who are primarily opponents to Rome in Jerusalem at the last stages of the war, or during the revolt of 66-70, and another group founded in Galilee he will refer to ultimately as the Sicarii, right? Now we know that this word, both words, by the way, Kanaim and Sikarikon, found their way into rabbinic literature. But these are two distinct groups. The Sicarii, because they have a sika, a dagger that they hide under their clothing and use it as terrorists would, right, within crowded areas. They actually emerge in the Galilee. And here in source number 10, he tells us when this happened. It happens in the year 6, when after Herod's death, Herod's son Archelaus was appointed by his father as king of Judea. He was a total failure, and after 10 years, in the year 6, the Romans banished the son of Herod from Judea and turned Judea into the equivalent of a Roman province. And the first thing you do when you establish a province is you carry out a census. A census is not necessarily just counting the number of people in the territory, but actually it's an appraisal of the property that each person possesses, which of course brings home to people the fact that they have been conquered and they will now be paying taxes to a foreign entity. And so we're told that Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria, also visited Judea, which had been annexed to Syria, in order to make an assessment of the property of the Jews, to liquidate the state of Archelaus, the son of Herod, who was banished in 6, this I added, of course. Although the Jews were at first shocked to hear of the registration of property, they gradually condescended, yielding to the arguments of the high priest Joazar to go no further in opposition. This is an important line in Josephus. He says, the Jews may have been upset by this, but they're normal, and they realize they've been conquered, and the high priest told them, you can't oppose these Roman conquerors, and so they acquiesced. But a certain Judah, a Gaulanite from the city of Gamala. Now, Judah is the son of Ezekias, who was executed by Herod in the previous page. In other words, what we have here is a family of opponents to Rome. So a certain Judas, a Gaulanite from Gamala, who had enlisted the aid of Sadok a Pharisee, threw himself into the cause of rebellion. Now, they said that the assessment carried with it a status amounting to downright slavery and appealed to the nation to make a bid for independence. They urged that heaven would be their zealous helper to no lesser end. In other words, God will be on your side if you do this. I'll get to that in a second. Then the furthering of their enterprise until it succeeded. But when will God assist them? If they did not shrink from the bloodshed that might be necessary. And now, he said, in this they sowed the seed from which sprang strife between factions and the slaughter of fellow citizens. In other words, here, Josephus claims, this is where you really begin this internal bloodletting among Jews, not back with the Roman conquest, but only when this new philosophy emerges saying what? You are forbidden to recognize Roman conquest, and they're going to tell us this is the equivalent to Avodah Zarah. Look at source number 11. It's a fourth philosophy. As for the fourth of the philosophies, Judas the Galilean set himself as the leader of it. This school agrees in all other respects with the opinions of the Pharisees, except that they have a passion for liberty that is almost unconquerable, since they are convinced that God alone is their leader and master. In other words, what are they doing? They are raising political independence to the level of a religious requirement. In other words, they're opposed to Rome not because it offends their what? Their national pride. They are opposed to Rome because you may not recognize another sovereign save for God himself. And remember, the Roman emperors, when Josephus was writing his book, he knew that ultimately Roman emperors would become deities. And any Jew living in the land of Israel, if he took out a Roman coin, he saw that the coin said Divus Augustus on it. The Augustus, the deity, the god. By the way, we know that Jews, when they saw this, with a picture of Augustus on the coin itself, and we know that there were Jews who actually took out their penknife or whatever, and they kind of rubbed out the picture of the emperor. If a little gold or silver came off the coin, that was an inducement to piety, right? What happened to that coin? That coin became a coin without a symbol on it because it was rubbed out. It became a coin without a siman or an asimon, right? In other words, it became a coin with a rubbed out picture on it. Now, I have to be fair. Most Roman emperors, if you were really loved like Augustus was, when he died in the year 14, he became a god, right? You became a god usually upon your death. I can guarantee most Roman emperors highly preferred their imperial status to their deification, right? And there's a story with Vespasian is on his deathbed, surrounded by his men, his henchmen. He looks up at them and he says, I fear I'm about to become a god, right? Somehow, joining the Roman pantheon was not his uppermost, right? Uppermost in his mind. But here you find the stirrings of that understanding, right? They are convinced that God alone is their leader and master. They think little of submitting to death in unusual forms and permitting vengeance to fall on kinsmen and friends, if only they may avoid calling any man master. And here Josephus says, this isn't Judaism. This is an innovation. In source number 12, here is a lesson that an innovation and reform in ancestral traditions weighs heavily in the scale in leading to the destruction of the congregation. In this case, Judas and Sadok started among us an intrusive fourth school of philosophy. So Josephus is apologizing for Judaism here by stressing this is an intrusive new idea, this new philosophy. It never existed prior to this. The Jews are normal, right? These people are the exception. And, of course, this ideology we know came from that Galilean group. When the war broke out, we are told that members of that group, in fact, I think I have it here. Yes, one of the descendants of these, if you skip to source number 14, at this period, a certain Menachem, son of Judas, surnamed the Galilean, that redoubtable doctor who in old days under Quirinius had upbraided the Jews for recognizing the Romans as masters when they already had God. We are told that the leader of the party, as the war broke out, took his intimate friends to Masada, where he broke into King Herod's armory and provided arms for his fellow townsmen and other brigands. Then with these men for a bodyguard, he returned like a veritable king to Jerusalem, became leader of the revolution, and directed the siege of the palace. This is the palace of the Herodian family, Agrippus II, and so on. But this is very interesting. We're told that the descendants of the Sicarii of the Galileans come down to Masada, break into the armory, get weapons, go to Jerusalem, take over the war. What does that mean, take over the war? It means there was another fighting force in Jerusalem at the time. Josephus refers to them as the Zealots. And so now we have a confrontation between two different rebelling parties, right? The Zealots in Jerusalem, the Sicarii, or fourth philosophy that made its way in. At first, they were successful, and ultimately, Menachem is murdered, and this group leaves Jerusalem, almost after a very short period, goes back to Masada, and we will encounter them in Masada 3 years, or maybe 4 years later, with the fall of Masada, 4 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. But these are the same people. And if you look at source number 13, you find the same ideology in that famous speech attributed to Elazar ben Yair, the commander of Masada, who was a descendant of these Galileans. And his famous speech, which of course Josephus wrote, "Long since, my brave men, we determined neither to serve the Romans nor any other save God, for he alone is man's true and righteous Lord." And then he goes on to try to convince them. He makes a speech that doesn't convince them, and then a second speech that apparently does. So it's very interesting here that we have then, what we're going to encounter are different groups making their way to Jerusalem. Now I can go a bit further with this. The revolt broke out, as we will see in a few minutes, in the year 66 of the Common Era. The year 66, 67 was really a preparatory year. The Jews are putting together a government, the government of the rebellion, and that's when Josephus Flavius is appointed to be commander of Galilee. The Romans, on their part, did not take this uprising seriously at first. They asked the governor of Syria, Cassius Gallus, simply march down into Judea, quell the rebellion immediately, and that's it, and it'll all end very, very quickly. Cassius Gallus marches, takes the straight road from Shechem down through Ramallah up to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, or towards the Temple Mount, where he suddenly realizes he has taken an insufficient force with him. He realized that this rebellion is far more serious than he imagined, and so he decides to retreat back the way he came. He's retreating more or less along Road 443. Okay? He goes by way of Beit Horon, which is exactly where the road goes today, right? And that's where the Jews wait in ambush. And they ambush the Roman force, take their weapons and return to Jerusalem as heroes. And that, of course, was the greatest tragedy that could have happened, because they are now convinced if you know where and when to attack the Romans, you can defeat them. And as a result, the spirit of revolution is enhanced tremendously in Jerusalem as we head into the fall of the year 66. By the winter of 66, 67, the Jerusalemites appoint their government, as I said, with what is interesting, if you read the names of the people that were appointed to the rebellion, to the government of the rebellion, these are all the aristocracy, the worst possible leaders. These are people who had everything to lose with this revolution and whose hearts were not in it. And the most obvious example is Josephus himself. It's mind-boggling. Josephus is appointed to be commander of Galilee, opposing the Roman legions, and yet he has no real belief that this war is going anywhere. I have to read one example to tell you who we're dealing with Josephus. He describes the events that take place during that year of 66 in Jerusalem. He says that basically the terrorists have taken over the city. And I tried to dissuade them from going to war against the Romans, foreseeing that the end of the war would be most disastrous for us. My efforts were unavailing. The madness of these desperate men was far too strong for me. And now he tells us, this is an insightful story. I now feared that my incessant reiteration of this warning would bring me into odium and suspicion of siding with the enemy. And I would run the risk of being arrested by the rebels and put to death. I therefore sought asylum in the inner court of the temple. The fortress of Antonia, which is adjacent to the temple, had already fallen into Zealot hands. When Menachem, the chief brigand, had been put to death, I thought this might be the opportunity to convince people to lay down their arms. I ventured out of the temple, consorted with the chief priests, leading Pharisees. We were, however, in a state of great alarm. We saw the populace in arms. We're at a loss what to do ourselves. We were powerless to check the revolutionaries. And now comes the telling statement. In such obvious and imminent peril, we professed to concur in their views. In other words, we feigned going along with the revolutionaries, but suggested that they make no move, leave the enemy to abandon the city, those Romans that are in the city, let them leave in order to get, etc. In so doing, we had hopes that ere long, Cestius, that's the Cestius scholars I referred to, would come up with a large army and quell the revolution. This is mind-boggling. This is the man who 2-3 months later is going to be appointed commander of the rebel armies. But of course, remember, when he writes this in his autobiography, he knows who's going to read this, the Roman emperors, right? And he wants them to know, I was on your side all along, right? I just feigned going along with the revolutionaries. And so what we have here is a strange situation. Now, I want to just point out source number 14 before we continue. First of all, Menachem appears as a veritable king. When I see the word king, this conjures up certain possible images. The word king is not bandied about that easily. And we have to wonder if there is not some messianic implication here. By the way, you'll notice what his name is. Menachem, right? His name is Menachem, and I needn't remind you that that's one of the names of the Messiah, whatever Messiah you might be thinking about, right? But the name Menachem actually is referred to in rabbinic literature and elsewhere. So you have to, and he appears as a veritable king. I'm going to suggest, and I'm not going to suggest that Josephus and Tacitus will claim that there was at least a latent, or maybe even more than that, messianic fervor that now took over in certain circles of the Jewish population. But we have to realize what's happening. The war then continues. Vespasian is sent with an army of so many 3 legions, plus an auxiliary force. He had about 60,000 Roman soldiers at his disposal. There was no way the Jews would ultimately be victorious. That's just an overpowering professional army. It is the war machine of the day. Vespasian doesn't march on Jerusalem, but rather he isolates portions of the country. He captures Galilee. He captures the Golan. He then comes down towards Samaria and parts of Judea. Every tract of land that is conquered by the Romans, the refugees of that part of the land stream to Jerusalem. And so, beyond everything else we've seen until now, Jerusalem during the revolt became a microcosm of different Jewish populations who held different Jewish ideologies, who had different leaders. Some of them were popular, I would almost say, socialist types of leaders bringing about or striving for a rising of the poor against the rich, and we'll see a source to that effect. Others have maybe some sort of messianic bent to them. Others, of course, we've seen the Sicarii believing what they believe. If you look at source number 15, this is also very telling. The royalists, meaning the pro-Roman Jewish elements, now outmatched in numbers and audacity, were forced to evacuate the upper city. The upper city is the area from the Jaffa Gate and the higher part of Jerusalem. The victors, meaning the rebels, burst in and set fire to the house of Ananias the high priest and to the palaces of Agrippa, this is Agrippa II, and Berenike. But now comes an interesting sidelight. They next carried their combustibles to the public archives, eager to destroy the moneylenders' bonds and to prevent the recovery of debts, in order to win over a host of grateful debtors and to cause a rising of the poor against the rich. This is fascinating. Oh yes, we're going to war against the Romans, but if somebody remembers to set the archive on fire so that the poor can rise up against the rich, that's also good. Right? In other words, who are these poor that are debtors? Remember something. Herod began, we saw this last week, a project of rebuilding not just the temple, but much of Jerusalem. The project ended somewhere during the first century, leaving hundreds and thousands of people in Jerusalem unemployed. You had all these people who were brought into Jerusalem to participate in the rebuilding project of the city, and now they're out of work, and they become debtors, right? And they are perfect, right? They are the ideal element to be used, as it were, to rise up against the aristocracy, the pro-Roman aristocracy. Not only that, there are Jewish rebels from around the country that are doing just this, freeing slaves. One very impressive fellow, a man by the name of Simon Bar Giora, who may have even come from non-Jewish stock, Bar Giora Meiming Ben Gerim, right? But we find him going around Transjordan, where he was born, and freeing slaves and bringing them to Jerusalem. There he clashes in Jerusalem with another Jewish leader from Galilee, Yochanan of Gush Chalav. So that there are different leaders that make their way to Jerusalem, and clearly this is a very, very tense period within the city, and all the different groups and all the different ideologies now find themselves, confronting one another. The Jerusalem group is known as Zealots. And here, I'm sidetracking for a moment on page number 4 to show you what Josephus thought about Zealots. For Josephus, if you look at number 17, for instance, he tells us the peace party's efforts were supported by the most eminent of the high priests, Jesus, son of Gamaliel, and Hanan, son of Hanan, who at their meetings vehemently upbraided the people for their apathy and incited them against the Zealots. For so, meaning zealots, these miscreants called themselves as though they were zealous in the course of virtue and not for vice in its basest and most extravagant form. In other words, for him, zealot becomes a dirty word. And the 18 says the same thing. In this, the so-called zealots excelled, a class which justified their name by their actions. They copied every deed of ill, nor was there any previous villainy recorded in history that they failed zealously to emulate. Now, I once wrote an article, and I found something fascinating. Josephus, when he wrote about the Hasmonean uprising, he copies the first book of Maccabees slavishly. And this first book of Maccabees posed a real problem for Josephus. First of all, because if you read the book of Maccabees, what happened? I mean, this is the Chanukah that we all celebrate. Rabim biyad me'atim, and so on. The few defeated the many. And that's the whole thrust of the book. Judah Maccabee makes a speech to his soldiers who are frightened out of their minds when they encounter the Hellenistic army. And Judah says, right, have no fear, it's in God's power that the few defeat the many. Now Josephus, when he makes speeches to the zealots of his time, he says, you people are crazy. You're outnumbered by the Romans. But there must have been somebody in the audience who said, wait a minute, you've never celebrated Hanukkah? You've never read the first book of Maccabees? You copied the first book of Maccabees. Your hero is Judah Maccabee, who says it's in God's power to have the few defeat the many. What is Josephus going to do? He solves the problem brilliantly. The book of Maccabees says, have no fear, it's in God's power that the few defeat the many. When you read the paraphrase in Josephus, it says, have no fear, it's in God's power that the few defeat the many if the few are righteous. A slight emendation, right? It's what we call new historians, right? In other words, what is the point here, right? The Maccabees of old, yes, they were the few, but they were righteous, hence they were victorious. But you zealots are brigands, you are common criminals, you have no chance. If you read the first chapters of 1 Maccabees, you see how delicate this was for Josephus. Look at source number 16, right? Josephus describes the famous event at Modi'in, Mattathias. You remember the story. The Greeks send an official to the village of Modi'in. The Greek official sets up an altar, a pagan altar, because Antiochus Epiphanes has decreed that Jews have to sacrifice, right? But of course, no true Jew would sacrifice on a pagan altar, and then a Jew shows up, and he's going to do it. Mattathias comes running and slays him. And Josephus describes it. But when he, Mattathias, ceased speaking, one of the Jews came forward and in their midst sacrificed as Antiochus commanded. Whereupon Mattathias, in rage, rushed upon him with his sons, who had brought knives, and cut down the man himself, and also made an end of Apelles, the king's officer. By the way, does this conjure up a story? Right? Well, this is interesting. So Mattathias kills the Jew, the renegade Jew, and the Roman official. But compare his source. In Josephus' source, what do we find? When he and it's almost word for word, except for slight divergences. When he, Mattathias, had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer a sacrifice on the altar in Modi'in, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw this, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officers, who was forcing them to sacrifice. He tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the Lord, just as Pinchas did against Zimri, a chapter that we just read in synagogues a week or so ago. Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come with me. You notice what Josephus did? Every time it said zealous in his source, what did he do? He erased the word. In other words, we don't want to raise the zealots on a pedestal as what? As the ideal Jew who is willing to be zealous on God's behalf and fight the enemy, because we don't believe in zealotry in that particular manner, right? Or we won't use the phrase. So you see what's happening. There's historical memory, and Josephus, the historian, nevertheless, has to vie with this. Turn to page 5, please. And we'll have to go rather quickly here. We know that Jewish society in Jerusalem was also now falling asunder. It was beginning to collapse. One of the first elements of this process was the high priesthood. Remember, beginning with Herod, the high priests were appointed. This is no longer an issue of father-son all the time. Either Herod appoints them, later on the Romans. And we read a Talmudic source that tells us that ultimately the high priesthood became alienated from the people. Abba Shaul ben Botnit, in the name of Abba Yosef ben Chanin, would say as follows: woe is me of the house of Boethus, woe is me of their staves, woe is me of the house of Chanin, woe is me of their whisperings. In other words, this is a ditty scoffing at the high priestly families. Woe is me of the house of Kathros, woe is me of their pens. Woe is me of the house of Ishmael ben Fiabi, woe is me of their fists. They are high priests. Their sons are temple treasurers. Their sons-in-law are trustees. Their servants beat the people with staves. In other words, the temple has now become a private business of priests, and there's total disdain. And sure enough, if you read, you'll see this is one of the first acts of the Zealots, when the war really breaks out in Jerusalem, is to appoint one of their own as a high priest. In other words, leadership now is going to become ineffectual in Jerusalem. And then we hear a very strange story in rabbinic literature telling us that this dissension found its way into rabbinic ranks, or proto-rabbinic ranks as well, the houses of Hillel and Shammai. And there's a frightening story. These are some of the halachot that were decreed in the upper room of a man called Hananiah ben Chizkiah Bagaron when they came to visit him. The rabbis tell us that during the uprising, some 18 decrees were issued, all of them dealing with relationships between, one way or another, with Jews and non-Jews. There's a tendency of distancing yourself from all sorts of others in the land. And then we're told that when they went to that house to make these decisions, that day was tragic for Israel, as was the day when the golden calf was produced. It was taught by Joshua ben Ono, of Ono. The disciples of the house of Shammai stood below. Remember, they're going to the second story. And they would slay the disciples of the house of Hillel. It was taught, 6 of them of the house of Hillel went up. The others were attacked by swords and lances. So suddenly, this ideal, Elu va'elu, divrei Elokim chayim, Hillel and Shammai, right? Here you have the exact opposite of the atmosphere on the eve of the destruction, where even within these rabbinic ranks, there seems to be tension. Now, interestingly, an Israeli scholar a number of years ago, and this goes back to the historian Gretz, who already made this assumption, but this current Israeli historian actually wrote an interesting book on Beit Shammai, claiming that the house of Shammai, during the revolt of 66-70, was aligned with the Zealots. In other words, they are the more extreme nationalist, if you want, or anti-Roman element within the rabbinic movement. So that even among the rabbis themselves, there are different approaches. It's not just among the house of the Hasmoneans and among the various priests, but even within the rabbinic milieu itself. There are 2 other issues that require attention before we can finish. One of them is to imagine that it's only internal Jewish dissension in Judea leading up to the war would be a total mistake. We tend to forget that the land of Judea was populated not just by Jews. There are Jews, there are Samaritans, there are Greeks, there are Syrians, there are Idumeans, all sorts of types in the land. The Romans control the land. Were they successful, had they been successful, in maintaining a neutral position towards these different groups, they might have precluded, they might have prevented this outburst of Jewish, as it were, opposition to the Roman conquest. But we find time and time again that Jews would clash not necessarily with Romans, but with other groups within the land, be they Greeks in the Transjordan, the Greeks of the city of Caesarea, the Samaritans, and then they would expect to have recourse to a neutral mediator, being the Romans, who would try to justly resolve the issue between Jews and others. Invariably, the Romans are going to side with the opposition to the Jews. Now, why? Because when Rome came to the Middle East and to Judea as part of the Middle East, they, in their own self-image, automatically attached themselves to the Greek element of the East. They considered themselves to be the perpetuators, as it were, or those continuing the Hellenistic culture atmosphere of the East. In fact, as you all know, they would bring Greek teachers to Rome to teach to the children of Rome Greek. That's how many of the Roman authors actually wrote in Greek and not only in Latin. And as a result, every time one of these clashes takes place, and the Romans automatically side with the adversaries of the Jews, Jewish elements feel they have no recourse save to take up arms and to take the law into their own hands. So here we find a totally different and additional reason for this tension within the land as we approach the destruction. I can't read all of the examples, but I would like to read two. The first one deals with all sorts of clashes between Jews and Greeks of the Transjordan, the city of Philadelphia, Amman. But for me, much more important is source number 22. There arose a quarrel between the Jewish and Syrian inhabitants of Caesarea on the subject of equal civic rights. The Jews claimed that they had the precedence because the founder of Caesarea, their king Herod, had been of Jewish descent. The Syrians admitted what they said about Herod. Yes, he was Jewish, but a Herod that Caesarea had been before then called Strato's Tower, and that before Herod's time, there was not a single Jewish inhabitant in the city. In other words, this was never a Jewish city. And so we should have the upper hand. And then Josephus tells us an interesting story. The Jews had a synagogue in Caesarea. They wanted to buy the land adjacent to the synagogue and enhance the building. The land was owned by the non-Jewish residents of the town. By the way, there is a remains of a synagogue in Caesarea. If you've ever, I'm sure you've all been to Caesarea. If you remember when you leave the city, the wall on the north, and you know where the aqueduct is, just between the wall to the north and the aqueduct are remains of an ancient Jewish synagogue, with even the remains of a few inscriptions. Maybe this is the synagogue that I'm going to refer to. So we're told that the Jews wanted to expand the land, the territory of the synagogue. The Greeks refused to sell them the land. And then one Shabbat, Jews come to synagogue to pray, and they find the Greeks set up a pagan altar near the entrance to the synagogue. The hotheads among the Jewish youth wanted to immediately take the law into their own hands. The elders tried to quiet them down, but to no avail. And the Jews attacked the Greeks, but this was a provocation. That was the intention, to have the Jews attacked so there could be a counterattack. The counterattack immediately brings about a mini massacre of Jews, and the massacre of Jews from Caesarea spreads to the mixed cities, even as far as Syria, but mixed cities in the area of Israel and just beyond the border. And now we read here, when Felix, in the year 52, saw that their rivalry, meaning Jews and Greeks in the city, had taken on the shape of war, he rushed ahead and summoned the Jews to desist. When they did not obey, he armed his soldiers, let them loose upon them, and thus slew many of the Jews and took more alive. Another example are clashes between Jews and Samaritans. Remember, in Jewish sources and in Christian sources, you all know the story of the Good Samaritan, right? What is the underlying assumption of the story of the Good Samaritan, right? A Samaritan would never help a wounded Jew, right? Because they are natural enemies. And we have the following. Hatred also arose between, this is source 23, Samaritans and Jews, for the following reason. It was the custom of the Galileans at the time of a festival to pass through Samaritan territory on their way to the holy city. And then we're told that during one of these, or on the eve of one of these festivals, the Galileans are attacked by the Samaritans. They slew a great number of them. The leaders of the Galileans, I skipped a few lines. The leaders, and this is typical, came to Cumanus, the Roman governor, and besought him to seek out the murderers, the Samaritan murderers of those who had been slain. He, however, having been bribed by the Samaritans, neglected to avenge him. The Galileans, indignant at this, urged Jewish masses to resort to arms. So this is the story repeating itself. Jews resorting to arms when they do not have, they're not getting a fair deal, as it were, on the part of the Roman rulers of the land. And then there's one final issue. And this is the eschatological impulses that may have existed at this time. Josephus this is source number 24, makes the following statement. Why were Jews fighting till the very end, he says. But what more than all else incited them to the war was an ambiguous oracle, likewise found in their sacred scriptures, to the effect that at that time one from their country would become ruler of the world. What is he referring to? Okay. This they understood to mean. Now here's where you really want to punch Josephus. This they understood to mean someone of their own race. And many of their wise men went astray in their interpretation. In other words, the oracle was saying the ruler of the world will come from Judea. And Josephus says it was true. The oracle is correct. You have to only identify who this ruler would be. The oracle, however, in reality signified the sovereignty of Vespasian, who was proclaimed emperor on Jewish soil. In other words, indeed, the ruler of the world really did come from Judea. Who was he? Vespasian. Because Vespasian, as a Roman general in the year, remember the year 68, 69 is the year of the 4 emperors in Rome. After Nero kills himself, the Romans were not successful in putting a Roman emperor on the throne for more than a few months. And ultimately, the army here in our land appointed Vespasian to become the emperor. He goes back to Rome, appoints his son Titus to continue and complete the war, and that, of course, brings about the destruction of Jerusalem. So here, Josephus knows, yes, there's some messianic belief that the ruler of the world will come from the land of Israel, if only they realized that the intention was Vespasian and not some Jewish Messiah. By the way, Tacitus, the Roman, and I refer to him here in his history, right? He says the same thing. There were all sorts of signs in the stars and in the skies. And there were omens. And the majority firmly believed that their ancient priestly writings contained the prophecy that this was the very time when the East would grow strong and men coming from Judea should possess the world. This mysterious prophecy, in reality, pointed to Vespasian and Titus. Josephus, however, tells another story, one that took place, and here, I'm not exaggerating, literally this week, so many years ago, in the days just prior to the destruction of the temple, meaning probably closer to next week, the first days of the month of Av. He tells the story of a few hundred Jews. Remember, the Romans are at the gates already of the temple, not of the city. It's a foregone conclusion. It's a matter of hours, if not days, until the Temple Mount falls. And then we're told that some hundreds of Jews in the Temple Mount are suddenly destroyed, and in the following way. Some were killed plunging out the flames, others perished amidst them, and out of all that multitude not a soul escaped. Now, what were these Jews doing on the Temple Mount at the time? They owed their destruction to a false prophet, who had on that day proclaimed to the people in the city that God commanded them to go up to the temple court to receive there the tokens of their deliverance. In other words, they had been convinced by false prophets that the ultimate deliverance is just a matter of moments. And of course, you can imagine what they believe. That true deliverance that will only take place when you were on the very verge, at the edge of the abyss, when everything seems lost. That's when God will, intervene on behalf of his temple. And then he says, numerous prophets indeed were at this period suborned by the tyrants, meaning the zealots, to delude the people by bidding them await help from God in order that desertions might be checked. In adversity, man is quickly persuaded, and the sufferer wholly abandons himself to expectation. What's going on here? Remember the War of the Sons? For instance, I'll just throw this out as a possibility. The War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. When will this happen? There will be an ongoing battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And in that ongoing battle, we will be victorious and they will. We, they. What does that mean? If you address this to what was happening in their day, every Roman victory might be interpreted as what? One stage closer to the ultimate redemption. Because according to that recipe, the forces of evil are going to be victorious in a series of battles until the seventh ultimate battle takes place when God will intervene and so on. So I can easily imagine, right, people believing, as Josephus tells us and as Tacitus seems to know, people actually believe, or some people possibly believe, that they are on the very, right, as I say, edge of messianic redemption, which will only come after these terrible calamities take place. Having said that, I'll go even a step further, and we'll conclude maybe with this. We've noticed, and if you read Josephus, it's clear, and if you read the rabbis, it's clear. If you read Tractate Gittin, or Eicha Midrash Rabbah to Lamentations, or if you read Josephus, and here they concur, Jews are shedding Jewish blood. And the question, of course, is, even at this very late stage, when the war is about to be concluded, what's going on? If anyone believed that this would be the ultimate redemption, Jews, when they talk about the future redemption, very often, what do they compare it with? The previous redemption. There's the historical redemption of the past, and the future eschatological redemption of the future. What is the classic ancient redemption, of course? Egypt, right? That was clearly the redemption, Yitziat Mitzrayim. What do we read about? Or how did the rabbis, and I would submit that it might have been pre-rabbinic as well, what do we read about? We know that there were 10 plagues, and the 9th plague was the plague of darkness. And look at source number 26, which is an early Midrash, Mechilta. And the children of Israel went up armed. Chamushim yatzu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. And the Midrash says, chamushim from the word chamesh. Chamush can mean armed, but it can come from the word chamesh, they would claim. Chamushim, they came up from the land of Egypt, 1 out of 5, chamisha. Others say 1 out of 50, chamishim. Others say 1 out of 500, chamesh me'ot. Even if you only say 1 out of 5, 1 out of 5 left, meaning that 80% died in Egypt, right? And indeed, the Midrash says, many of the Jews having died in Egypt. When? In the 3 days of darkness, of which it is written, one man did not see another. Ishet Re'ehu, and the Re'eh would be the Jew. They, the Jews, were burying their dead. And they gave thanks and praise to the Holy One, blessed be He, that their foes did not see, and rejoice in their downfall. In other words, had the Egyptians seen that Jews were dying as well in this plague of darkness, they would have said, well, there's a plague of darkness and all of the residents of Egypt are dying. But who are these 80% who had to die before the exodus from Egypt could take place? Is this haphazard, just some 80%? No, according to the Midrash. Look at source 27. Why darkness? Because of the sinners of Israel. Now again, remember we saw this in the War of the Sons of Light and Darkness and in the Damascus document. The sinners of Israel will also pay the price, not just the Gentiles, in the ultimate redemption. Because of the sinners of Israel who had patrons among the Egyptians. And they had there, meaning the Jews, the Israelites, had honor and wealth. There are variants here that say that they disclosed Israel's secrets to the Egyptians. This is a variant manuscript. And these evil sinners of Israel did not want to leave Egypt. God said, if I bring upon them a plague in the open and they die, the Egyptians will say that just as we suffered, so did they. Therefore, he brought darkness among the Egyptians for 3 days so that Israel could bury its dead and the Egyptians would not see them. In other words, what is this Midrash suggesting? Before redemption could take place, the people have to be purged. They have to be purged of all the sinners. because redemption cannot take place without the removal of this barrier to redemption. And the barrier are the sinners who in Egypt were killed during darkness. And you have to wonder, and I'm just throwing this out as this possibility, that there might have been people, like these people following the prophets up to the Temple Mount on the eve of destruction. Who knows if there were not zealots, and remember, I'm using this phrase specifically, who believed we will only receive ultimate redemption if the sinners among us, right, are done away with. And of course, invariably, the sinners are the others, and we are the forces of good. What I've tried to do is give you a sense of different possibilities, and we don't know what the proportion was. How much of this is Jews against Greeks, how much Jews against Samaritans, Jews versus Jews, and of course Jews versus Romans, right? But what I tried to show is that it's a lot more complex. The background leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, is a much more complex affair than we are taught simply, right? Blind hatred brought about the destruction, right? As we've seen, there was blind hatred there, and clearly the rabbis could point to this as being an ultimate sin, but the factors that were involved here were very, were numerous, and all came together in this one horrific event at the end. Okay, we'll stop here.